The wind moved across the plains like an old hymn, whispering through brittle sage and the long yellow grass that rolled for miles under a copper sky. Dust gathered on the horizon, cowboys, maybe, or just the restless breath of the desert, but the woman on the porch didn't flinch. Clara Alden had been in harder places. The ranch at Lone Mesa wasn't much, a tired barn, a split-rail fence, and a herd of horses that were more bone than muscle. But it was hers, and for that she stayed. When she'd arrived a month earlier, the ranch hands had laughed. A woman? Alone? They joked she wouldn't last a week in that wind, that she'd sell off and go back east before the next storm rolled in. They didn't know Clara's story, didn't know she'd buried her husband under the same sky, and that she wasn't running from anything anymore. She was running toward the life he'd wanted to build. By noon the sky had burned itself pale, and the world shimmered with heat. That's when she saw him, a figure on horseback, black coat trailing behind him like smoke. He rode slow, unhurried, the way men do when they've got nowhere left to be. When he reached the gate, he tipped his hat. "Afternoon, ma'am." Clara studied him. His face was sun-creased, his eyes a color between steel and storm. "You're a long way from town," she said. "Lost my trail 2 nights back," he replied. "Name's Eli Brandt. Looking for work and a quiet place to stay." There was something about the way he said it, low, steady, that made her believe him. And besides, she needed hands. "You know horses?" she asked. He nodded once. "No, I'm better than people." "Then you'll fit right in," she said. By the week's end, Eli had done more in silence than the others had done with all their boasting. He mended fences, gentled a mean-eyed stallion, and never asked for anything but a place to sleep and black coffee in the morning. The men who'd laughed when Clara first arrived began to follow his lead, quiet, focused, respectful. At night, when the prairie cooled and coyotes sang beyond the ridge, Clara found herself listening for his footsteps outside the barn. Sometimes he'd pause by the porch, hat in hand, eyes lifted toward the stars. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. One evening, a storm rose from the south, churning dust into a brown wall that swallowed the sun. The herd spooked, bolting toward the flats. Clara ran out without thinking, pulling a scarf over her face, shouting against the wind. She didn't see the fence post crack, didn't hear Eli until his arm caught her around the waist. "Get back," he yelled. The post fell where she'd been standing. They crouched behind the corral wall until the worst passed. When the wind died, he still had his coat around her shoulders. She realized then that his hands were trembling, not from fear, but from holding her so tight. "You could have been killed," he said. "So could you," she answered, voice muffled in his coat. "Seems fair." For the first time, she saw him smile, a small, uneven thing that made the dust on his face look almost golden. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving the land washed clean and quiet. Clara stood by the fence, watching the sunrise spill over the hills, painting the wet earth in gold. Eli was already out in the pasture, mending what the wind had broken. His movements were calm, deliberate, as though the chaos of the night before hadn't touched him. When he looked up and saw her, he gave a small nod, nothing more. Yet something in that simple gesture warmed her more than the rising sun. For the first time in months, Clara felt she wasn't facing the horizon alone. Days turned into weeks, and the rhythm of the ranch settled into something steady, almost peaceful. Clara found herself listening for Eli's quiet footsteps at dusk, the creak of the barn door signaling another day survived. Sometimes they shared coffee by the fence, talking little but understanding much. When she laughed, a sound she hadn't made in years, Eli's eyes softened, like a man remembering warmth after too long in the cold. One evening, as the sky burned red, he handed her a repaired bridle and said, "You keep fixing this place." She smiled back. "Maybe it's fixing me too." Eli didn't answer right away. He just looked toward the horizon where the sun dipped behind the distant hills, shadows stretching long across the pasture. "Places like this," he said finally, his voice quiet as the evening wind, "they don't fix people. They just remind you what you're made of." Clara didn't know what to say to that. She wanted to ask what he'd been made of before he'd ridden into her life, but the look in his eyes stopped her. Some stories, she realized, had been told too many times already, Some wounds were better left to heal in silence. The summer wore on. The land grew mean again as it always did, too little rain, too much dust. But together they worked through it. Clara found herself leaning on Eli more than she meant to. He knew the land's moods, when to ride out early, when to wait, when to say nothing at all. His steadiness was its own kind of comfort. One afternoon, they rode fence along the south pasture. The heat shimmered off the ground, and Clara could feel sweat trickling down her back. "Never thought I'd last out here," she said, half to herself. Eli glanced over. "You're stronger than most men I've known." She laughed, shaking her head. "You don't know me that well." He didn't argue. "I know enough." They stopped by the old creek bed, dry now except for a trickle of muddy water. Clara watched a hawk wheel overhead and felt the ache of something she couldn't quite name. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked. Eli took his time answering. "Used to. Thought if I rode far enough, I'd find peace somewhere out there." He gestured to the open plains. "Turns out peace ain't in the distance, it's in the doing." That night, the ranch was quiet except for the low rustle of wind through the grass. Clara stood by the porch, lantern light flickering against the boards. She saw Eli by the corral, brushing down one of the horses, his hat tipped low. For a long time, she watched him work, the rhythm of his movements steady and patient. When he finally came up the path, she held out a cup of coffee. "You ever get tired of saving things?" she asked softly. He smiled faintly, taking the cup. "You ever get tired of starting over?" She shook her head. "No. Guess that's what keeps me going." Eli studied her for a moment. "Then I reckon we're both where we belong." The lantern light caught in his eyes, and for the first time, Clara saw the man behind the silence, the weariness, the strength, and the quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, they'd both found a kind of home. Out beyond the fence, the prairie stretched into darkness, endless and waiting. The wind carried the faint scent of rain. And as Clara stood beside Eli, listening to the horses shift and the night settle, she realized that for all the losses, all the storms, she was no longer standing back up alone. The next morning broke soft and gray, the sky swollen with the promise of long-needed rain. Clara stepped outside and breathed deep, the air cool and clean, heavy with the scent of wet earth. Eli was already saddling the bay mare, his movements quiet, deliberate as always. When he saw her, he smiled, not the guarded kind she'd grown used to, but one that reached his eyes. "Storm's coming," he said. She nodded. "Let it." They rode out together, checking the fences one last time before the downpour began.